Jean de Marseille, Inquisitor Extraordinary of the King of France, raised his head from the parchments that littered the crude desk at which he sat. His glance shifted along the long, stone-walled, torch-lit room to the file of mail-clad soldiers who stood like steel statues by its door. A word from him and two of them sprang forward. "You may bring in the prisoner," he said. The two disappeared through the door, and in moments there came a clang of opening bolts and grating of heavy hinges from somewhere in the building. Then the clang of the returning soldiers, and they entered the room with another man between them, whose hands were fettered. He was a straight figure, and was dressed in drab tunic and hose. His dark hair was long and straight, and his face held a dreaming strength altogether different from the battered visages of the soldiers or the changeless mask of the Inquisitor. The latter regarded the prisoner for a moment, and then lifted one of the parchments from before him and read from it in a smooth, clear voice. "Henri Lothiere, apothecary's assistant of Paris," he read, "is charged in this year of our Lord 1444 with offending against God and the King by committing the crime of sorcery." The prisoner spoke for the first time, his voice low but steady. "I am no sorcerer, sire." Jean de Marseille read calmly on from the parchment. "It has been stated by many witnesses that for long that part of Paris called Nanley by some has been troubled by works of the devil. Ever and anon great claps of thunder have been heard issuing from an open field there without visible cause. They were evidently caused by a sorcerer of power, since even exorcists could not halt them. It is attested by many that the accused, Henri Lothiere, did, in spite of the known diabolical nature of the thing, spend much time at the field in question. It is also attested that the said Henri Lothiere did state that in his opinion the thunderclaps were not of diabolical origin, and that if they were studied their cause might be discovered. It being suspected from this that Henri Lothiere was himself the sorcerer causing the thunderclaps, he was watched, and on the 3rd day of June was seen to go in the early morning to the unholy spot with certain instruments. There he was observed going through strange and diabolical conjurations, when there came suddenly another thunderclap, and the said Henri Lothiere did vanish entirely from view in that moment. This fact is attested beyond all doubt. The news spreading, many hundreds watched around the field during that day. Upon that night, before midnight, another thunderclap was heard, and the said Henri Lothiere was seen by these hundreds to appear at the field's center as swiftly and as strangely as he had vanished. The fear-stricken hundreds around the field heard him tell them how by diabolical power he had gone for hundreds of years into the future, a thing surely possible only to the devil and his minions, and heard him tell other blasphemies before they seized him and brought him to the Inquisitor of the King, praying that he be burned and his work of sorcery thus halted. Therefore, Henri Lothiere, since you were seen to vanish and to reappear as only the servants of the evil one might do, and were heard by many to utter the blasphemies mentioned, I must adjudge you a sorcerer with the penalty of death by fire. If anything there be that you can advance in palliation of your black offense, however, you may now do so before final sentence is passed upon you." Jean de Marseille laid down the parchment and raised his eyes to the prisoner. The latter looked round him quickly for a moment. A half-glimpsed panic for an instant in his eyes, then seemed to steady. "Sire, I cannot change the sentence you will pass upon me," he said quietly. "Yet do I wish well to relate once what happened to me and what I saw. Is it permitted me to tell that from first to last?" The Inquisitor's head bent, and Henri Lothiere spoke, his voice gaining in strength and fervor as he continued. "Sire, I, Henri Lothiere, am no sorcerer, but a simple apothecary's assistant. It was always my nature, from earliest youth, to desire to delve into matters unknown to men, the secrets of the earth and sea and sky, the knowledge hidden from us. I knew well that this was wicked, that the Church teaches all we need to know, and that heaven frowns when we pry into its mysteries. But so strong was my desire to know that many times I concerned myself with matters forbidden. I had sought to know the nature of the lightning, and the manner of flight of the birds, and the way in which fishes are able to live beneath the waters, and the mystery of the stars. So when these thunderclaps began to be heard in the parts of Paris in which I lived, I did not fear them so much as my neighbors. I was eager to learn only what was causing them, for it seemed to me that their cause might be learned. So I began to go to that field from which they issued, to study them. I waited in it, and twice I heard the great thunderclaps myself. I thought they came from near the field's center, and I studied that place, but I could see nothing there that was causing them. I dug in the ground. I looked up for hours into the sky, but there was nothing. And still, at intervals, the thunderclaps sounded. I still kept going to the field, though I knew that many of my neighbors whispered that I was engaged in sorcery. Upon that morning of the 3rd day of June, it had occurred to me to take certain instruments, such as lodestones, to the field to see whether anything might be learned with them. I went, a few superstitious ones following me at a distance. I reached the field's center and started the examinations I had planned. Then came suddenly another thunderclap, and with it I passed from the sight of those who had followed and were watching, vanished from view. Sire, I cannot well describe what happened in that moment. I heard the thunderclap come as though from all the air around me, stunning my ears with its terrible burst of sound. And at the same moment that I heard it, I was buffeted as though by awful winds and seemed falling downward through terrific depths. Then through the hellish uproar I felt myself bumping upon a hard surface, and the sounds quickly ceased from about me. I had involuntarily closed my eyes at the great thunderclap, but now slowly I opened them. I looked around me, first in stupefaction, and then in growing amazement, for I was not in that familiar field at all, sire, that I had been in a moment before. I was in a room lying upon its floor, and it was such a room as I had never seen before. Its walls were smooth and white and gleaming. There were windows in the walls, and they were closed with sheets of glass so smooth and clear that one seemed looking through a clear opening rather than through glass. The floor was of stone, smooth and seamless as though carven from one great rock, yet seeming not in some way to be stone at all. There was a great circle of smooth metal inset in it, and it was on it that I was lying. All around the room were many great things, the like of which I had never seen. Some seemed of black metal, seemed contrivances or machines of some sort. Black cords of wire connecting them to each other, and from part of them came a humming sound that did not stop. Others had glass tubes fixed on the front of them, and there were square black plates on which were many shining little handles and buttons. There was a sound of voices, and I turned to find that 2 men were bending over me. They were men like myself, yet they were at the same time like no men I had ever met. One was white-bearded, and the other plump and bare of face. Neither of them wore cloak or tunic or hose. Instead, they wore loose and straight-hanging garments of cloth. They were both greatly excited, it seemed, and were talking to each other as they bent over me. I caught a word or two of their speech in a moment, and found it was French they were talking, but it was not the French I knew, being so strange and with so many new words as to be almost a different language. I could understand the drift, though, of what they were saying. "We have succeeded," the plump one was shouting excitedly. "We've brought someone through at last." "They will never believe it," the other replied. "They'll say it was faked." "Nonsense," cried the first. "We can do it again, Rastin. We can show them before their own eyes." They bent toward me, seeing me staring at them. "Where are you from?" shouted the plump-faced one. "What time? What year? What century?" "He doesn't understand, Therkor," muttered the white-bearded one. "What year is it now, my friend?" he asked me. I found voice to answer. "Surely, sirs, whoever you be, you know that this is the year 1444, I said. That set them off again into a babble of excited talk, of which I could make out only a word here and there. They lifted me up, seeing how sick and weak I felt, and seated me in a strange but very comfortable chair. I felt dazed. The 2 were still talking excitedly, but finally the white-bearded one, Rastin, turned to me. He spoke to me very slowly so that I understood him clearly, and he asked me my name, and I told him. "Henri Lothiere," he repeated. "Well, Henri, you must try to understand. You are not now in the year 1444. You are 500 years in the future, or what would seem to you the future. This is the year 1944, and Rastin and I have jerked you out of your own time across 5 solid centuries," said the other, grinning. I looked from one to the other. "Messieurs," I pleaded, and Rastin shook his head. "He does not believe," he said to the other, then to me. "Where were you just before you found yourself here, Henri?" he asked. "In a field at the outskirts of Paris," I said. "Well, look from that window and see if you still believe yourself in your 15th century Paris." I went to the window and looked out. Mother of God, what a sight before my eyes! The familiar gray little houses, the open fields behind them, the saunterers in the dirt streets. All these were gone. It was a new and terrible city that lay about me. Its broad streets were of stone, and great buildings of many levels rose on either side of them. Great numbers of people dressed like the two beside me moved in the streets, and also strange vehicles or carriages, undrawn by horse or ox, that rushed to and fro, and undreamed of speed. I staggered back to the chair. "You believe now, Henri?" asked the white-bearded Rastin kindly enough, and I nodded meekly. My brain was whirling. He pointed to the circle of metal on the floor and the machines around the room. "Those are what we used to jerk you from your own time to this one," he said. "But how, sirs?" I asked. "For the love of God, how is it that you can take me from one time to another? Have ye become gods or devils?" "Neither one nor the other, Henri," he answered. "We are simply scientists, physicists, men who want to know as much as man can know, and who spend our lives in seeking knowledge." I felt my confidence returning. These were men such as I had dreamed might someday be. "But what can you do with time?" I asked. "Is not time a thing unalterable, unchanging?" Both shook their heads. "No, Henri, it is not. But lately have our men of science found that out." They went on to tell me things that I could not understand. It seemed they were telling me that their men of knowledge had found time to be a mere measurement or dimension, just as length or breadth or thickness. They mentioned names with reverence that I had never heard: Einstein, De Sitter, and Lorentz. I was in a maze at their words. They said that just as men use force to move or rotate matter from one point along the three known measurements to another, so might matter be rotated from one point in time, the fourth measurement, to another, if the right force were used. They said that their machines produced that force and applied it to the metal circle from 500 years before to this time of theirs. They had tried it many times, they said, but nothing had been on the spot at that time, and they had rotated nothing but the air above it from the one time to the other, and the reverse. I told them of the thunderclaps that had been heard at the spot in the field, and that had made me curious. They said that they had been caused by the changing of the air above the spot from one time to the other in their trials. I could not understand these things. They said then that I had happened to be on the spot when they had again turned on their force, and so had been rotated out of my own time into theirs. They said that they had always hoped to get someone living from a distant time in that way, since such a man would be a proof to all other men of knowledge of what they had been able to do. I could not comprehend, and they saw and told me not to fear. I was not fearful, but excited at the things that I saw around me. I asked of those things, and Rastin and Thicourt laughed and explained some of them to me as best they could. Much they said that I did not understand, but my eyes saw marvels in that room of which I had never dreamed. They showed me a thing like a small glass bottle with wires inside, and then told me to touch a button beneath it. I did so, and the bottle shone with a brilliant light exceeding that of scores of candles. I shrank back, but they laughed, and when Rastin touched the button again, the light in the glass thing vanished. I saw that there were many of these things in the ceiling. They showed me also a rounded black object of metal with a wheel at the end. A belt ran around the wheel and around smaller wheels connected to many machines. They touched a lever on this object, and a sound of humming came from it, and the wheel turned very fast, turning all the machines with the belt. It turned faster than any man could ever have turned it, yet when they touched the lever again, its turning ceased. They said that it was the power of the lightning in the skies that they used to make the light and to turn that wheel. My brain reeled at the wonders that they showed. One took an instrument from the table that he held to his face, saying that he would summon the other scientists or men of knowledge to see their experiment that night. He spoke into the instrument as though to different men, and let me hear voices from it answering him. They said that the men who answered were leagues separated from him. I could not believe, and yet somehow I did believe. I was half dazed with wonder, and yet excited too. The white-bearded man Rastin saw that, and encouraged me. Then they brought a small box with an opening, and placed a black disc on the box, and set it turning in some way. A woman's voice came from the opening of the box, singing. I shuddered when they told me that the woman was one who had died years before. Could the dead speak thus? How can I describe what I saw there? Another box or cabinet there was, with an opening also. I thought it was like that from which I had heard the dead woman singing, but they said it was different. They touched buttons on it, and a voice came from it speaking in a tongue I knew not. They said that the man was speaking thousands of leagues from us in a strange land across the uncrossed Western Ocean, yet he seemed speaking by my side. They saw how dazed I was by these things and gave me wine. At that I took heart, for wine at least was as it had always been. "You will want to see Paris, the Paris of our time, Omri?" asked Rastin. "But it is different and terrible," I said. "We'll take you," Thicourt said, "but first your clothes." He got a long light coat that they had me put on that covered my tunic and hose, and a hat of grotesque round shape that they put on my head. They led me then out of the building and onto the street. I gazed astoundingly along the street. It had a raised walk at either side on which many hundreds of people moved to and fro, all dressed in as strange a fashion. Many, like Rastin and Thicourt, seemed of gentle blood, yet in spite of this they did not wear a sword or even a dagger. There were no knights or squires or priests or peasants. All seemed dressed much the same. Small lads ran to and fro selling what seemed sheets of very thin white parchment, many times folded and covered with lettering. Rastin said that these had written in them all the things that had happened through all the world even but hours before. I said that to write even one of these sheets would take a clerk many days, but they said that the writing was done in some way very quickly, by machines. In the broad stone street between the two raised walks were rushing back and forth the strange vehicles I had seen from the window. There was no animal pulling or pushing any one of them, yet they never halted their swift rush and carried many people at unthinkable speed. Sometimes those who walked stepped before the rushing vehicles, and then from them came terrible warning snarls or moans that made the walkers draw back. One of the vehicles stood at the walk's edge before us, and we entered it and sat side by side on a soft leather seat. Thicourt sat behind a wheel on a post with levers beside him. He touched these, and a humming sound came from somewhere in the vehicle, and then it too began to rush forward. Faster and faster along the street it went, yet neither of them seemed afraid. Many thousands of these vehicles were moving swiftly through the streets about us. We passed on, between great buildings and along wider streets, my eyes and ears numbed by what I saw about me. Then the buildings grew smaller after we had gone for miles through them, and we were passing through the city's outskirts. I could not believe hardly that it was Paris in which I was. We came to a great flat and open field outside the city, and there Thicourt stopped, and we got out of the vehicle. There were big buildings at the field's end, and I saw other vehicles rolling out of them across the field, ones different from any I had yet seen, with flat, wing-like projections on either side. They rolled out over the field very fast, and then I cried out as I saw them rising from the ground into the air. Mother of God, they were flying! The men in them were flying! Rastin and Thicourt took me forward to the great buildings. They spoke to men there, and one brought forward one of the winged cars. Rastin told me to get in, and though I was terribly afraid, there was too terrible a fascination that drew me in. Thicourt and Rastin entered after me, and we sat in seats with the other man. He had before him levers and buttons, while at the car's front was a great thing like a double oar or paddle. A loud roaring came, and that double blade began to whirl so swiftly that I could not see it. Then the car rolled swiftly forward, bumping on the ground, and then ceased to bump. I looked down, then shuddered. The ground was already far beneath. I, too, was flying in the air. We swept upward at terrible speed that increased steadily. The thunder of the car was terrific, and as the man at the levers changed their position, we curved around and over, downward and upward as though birds. Rastin tried to explain to me how the car flew, but it was all too wonderful, and I could not understand. I only knew that a wild, thrilling excitement held me, and that it were worth life and death to fly thus, if but for once, as I had always dreamed that men might some day do. Higher and higher we went. The earth lay far beneath, and I saw now that Paris was indeed a mighty city, its vast mass of buildings stretching away almost to the horizon below us. A mighty city of the future that had been given my eyes to look on. There were other winged cars darting to and fro in the air about us, and they said that many of these were starting or finishing journeys of hundreds of leagues in the air. Then I cried out as I saw a great shape coming nearer us in the air. It was many rods in length, tapering to a point at both ends, a vast ship sailing in the air. There were great cabins on its lower part, and in them we glimpsed people gazing out, coming and going inside, dancing even. They told me that the vast ships of the air like this sailed to and fro for thousands of leagues with hundreds inside them. The huge vessel of the air passed us, and then our winged car began to descend. It circled smoothly down to the field like a swooping bird, and when we landed there, Rastin and Thikor led me back to the ground vehicle. It was late afternoon by then, the sun sinking westward, and darkness had descended by the time we rolled back into the great city. But in that city was not darkness. Lights were everywhere in it, flashing brilliant lights that shone from its mighty buildings and that blinked and burned and ran like water in great symbols upon the buildings above the streets. Their glare was like that of day. We stopped before a great building into which Rastin and Thikor led me. It was vast inside, and in it were many people in rows on rows of seats. I thought it a cathedral at first, but saw soon that it was not. The wall at one end of it, toward which all in it were gazing, had on it pictures of people, great in size, and those pictures were moving as though themselves alive. And they were talking to one another, too, as though with living voices. I trembled. What magic! With Rastin and Thikor in seats beside me, I watched the pictures enthralled. It was like looking through a great window into strange worlds. I saw the sea, seemingly tossing and roaring there before me, and then saw on it a ship, a vast ship of size incredible, without sails or oars, holding thousands of people. I seemed on that ship as I watched, seemed moving forward with it. They told me it was sailing over the western ocean that never men had crossed. I feared. Then another scene, land appearing from the ship, a great statue upholding a torch, and we on the ship seemed passing beneath it. They said that the ship was approaching a city, the city of New York, but mists hid all before us. Then suddenly the mists before the ship cleared, and there before me seemed the city. Mother of God, what a city! Climbing range on range of great mountain-like buildings that aspired up as though to scale heaven itself. Far beneath, narrow streets pierced through them, and in the picture we seemed to land from the ship to go through these streets of the city. It was an incredible city of madness. The streets and ways were mere chasms between the sky-toppling buildings. People, millions on millions of them rushed through the endless streets. Countless ground vehicles rushed to and fro also, and other different ones that roared above the streets, and still others below them. Winged flying cars and great airships were sailing to and fro over the titanic city, and in the waters around it great ships of the sea and smaller ships were coming as man never dreamed of, surely, that reached out from the mighty city on all sides. And with the coming of darkness, the city blazed with living light. The pictures changed, showed other mighty cities, though none so terrible as that one. It showed great mechanisms that appalled me, giant metal things that scooped in an instant from the earth as much as a man might dig in days, vast things that poured molten metal from them like water, others that lifted loads that hundreds of men and oxen could not have stirred. They showed men of knowledge like Rastin and Thikor beside me. Some were healers, working miraculous cures in a way that I could not understand. Others were gazing through giant tubes at the stars, and the pictures showed what they saw, showed that all of the stars were great suns like our sun, and that our sun was greater than Earth, that Earth moved around it instead of the reverse. How could such things be, I wondered? Yet they said that it was so, that Earth was round like an apple, and that with other Earths like it, the planets moved around the sun. I heard, but could scarce understand. At last Rastin and Thikor led me out of that place of living pictures and to their ground vehicle. We went again through the streets to their building, where first I had found myself. As we went, I saw that none challenged my right to go, nor asked who was my lord, and Rastin said that none now had lords, but that all were lord, king, and priest, and noble, having no more power than any in the land. Each man was his own master. It was what I had hardly dared to hope for in my own time, and this, I thought, was greatest of all the marvels they had shown me. We entered again their building, but Rastin and Thicor took me first to another room than the one in which I had found myself. They said that their men of knowledge were gathered there to hear of their feat and to have it proved to them. "You would not be afraid to return to your own time, Henri?" asked Rastin, and I shook my head. "I want to return," I told them. "I want to tell my people there what I have seen, what the future is that they must strive for." "But if they should not believe you?" Thicor asked. "Still, I must go, must tell them," I said. Rastin grasped my hand. "You are a man, Henri," he said. Then, throwing aside the cloak and hat I had worn outside, they went with me down to the big white-walled room where first I had found myself. It was lit brightly now by many of the shining glass things on ceiling and walls, and in it were many men. They all stared strangely at me and at my clothes, and talked excitedly, so fast that I could not understand. Rastin began to address them. He seemed explaining how he had brought me from my own time to his. He used many terms and words that I could not understand, incomprehensible references and phrases, and I could understand but little. I heard again the names of Einstein and de Sitter that I had heard before, repeated frequently by these men as they disputed with Rastin and Thicor. They seemed disputing about me. One big man was saying, "Impossible, I tell you, Rastin, you have faked this fellow." Rastin smiled. "You don't believe that Thicor and I brought him here from his own time across 5 centuries? A chorus of excited negatives answered him. He had me stand up and speak to them. They asked me many questions, part of which I could not understand. I told them of my life and of the city of my own time, and of king and priest and noble, and of the many simple things that they seemed quite ignorant of. Some appeared to believe me, but others did not, and again their dispute broke out. "There is a way to settle the argument, gentlemen," said Rastin finally. "How?" all cried. "Thicor and I brought Henri across 5 centuries by rotating the time dimensions at this spot," he said. "Suppose we reverse that rotation and send him back before your eyes. Would that be proof?" They all said that it would. Rastin turned to me. "Stand on the metal circle, Henri," he said. I did so. All were watching very closely. Thicor did something quickly with the levers and buttons of the mechanisms in the room. They began to hum, and blue light came from the glass tubes on some. All were quiet, watching me as I stood there on the circle of metal. I met Rastin's eyes, and something in me made me call goodbye to him. He waved his hand and smiled. Thicor pressed more buttons, and the hum of the mechanism grew louder. Then he reached toward another level. All in the room were tense, and I was tense. Then I saw Thicor's arm move as he turned one of the many levers. A terrific clap of thunder seemed to break around me, and as I closed my eyes before its shock, I felt myself whirling around and falling at the same time, as though into a maelstrom, just as I had done before. The awful falling sensation ceased in a moment, and the sound subsided. I opened my eyes. I was on the ground at the center of the familiar field from which I had vanished hours before upon the morning of that day. It was night now, though for that day I had spent 500 years in the future. There were many people gathered around the field, fearful, and they screamed, and some fled when I appeared in the thunderclap. I went toward those who remained. My mind was full of things I had seen, and I wanted to tell them of these things. I wanted to tell them how they must work ever toward the future time of wonder. But they did not listen. Before I had spoken minutes to them, they cried out on me as a sorcerer and a blasphemer, and seized me and brought me here to the Inquisitor, to you, sire. And to you, sire, I have told the truth in all things. I know that in doing so I have set the seal of my own fate, and that only a sorcerer would tell such a tale. Yet despite that, I am glad that I have told one at least of this time, of what I saw 5 centuries in the future. Glad that I saw the things that someday, sometime, must come to be.
The table. Pinlighting is a hell of a way to earn a living. Underhill was furious as he closed the door behind himself. It didn't make much sense to wear a uniform and look like a soldier if people didn't appreciate what you did. He sat down in his chair, laid his head back in the headrest, and pulled the helmet down over his forehead. As he waited for the pin set to warm up, he remembered the girl in the outer corridor. She had looked at it, then looked at him scornfully. Meow. That was all she had said, yet it had cut him like a knife. What did she think he was? A fool? A loafer? A uniformed non-entity? Didn't she know that for every half hour of pinlighting he got a minimum of 2 months recuperation in the hospital? By now the set was warm. He felt the squares of space around him, sensed himself at the middle of an immense grid, a cubic grid, full of nothing. Out in that nothingness he could sense the hollow, aching horror of space itself, and could feel the terrible anxiety which his mind encountered whenever it met the faintest trace of inert dust. As he relaxed the comforting solidity of the sun, the clockwork of the familiar planets and the moon rang in on him. Our own solar system was as charming and as simple as an ancient cuckoo clock filled with familiar ticking and with reassuring noises. The odd little moons of Mars swung around their planet like frantic mice, yet their regularity was itself an assurance that all was well. Far above the plane of the ecliptic he could feel half a ton of dust, more or less, drifting outside the lanes of human travel. Here there was nothing to fight, nothing to challenge the mind, to tear the living soul out of a body with its roots dripping in effluvium as tangible as blood. Nothing ever moved in on the solar system. He could wear the pin set forever and be nothing more than a sort of telepathic astronomer, a man who could feel the hot, warm protection of the sun throbbing and burning against his living mind. Woodley came in. "Same old ticking world," said Underhill. "Nothing to report. No wonder they didn't develop the pin set until they began to planoform. Down here with the hot sun around us, it feels so good and so quiet. You can feel everything spinning and turning. It's nice and sharp and compact. It's sort of like sitting around home." Woodley grunted. He was not much given to flights of fantasy. Undeterred, Underhill went on. "It must have been pretty good to have been an ancient man. I wonder why they burned up their world with war. They didn't have to planoform. They didn't have to go out to earn their livings among the stars. They didn't have to dodge the rats or play the game. They couldn't have invented pinlighting because they didn't have any need of it, did they, Woodley?" Woodley grunted. "Uh-huh." Woodley was 26 years old and due to retire in one more year. He already had a farm picked out. He had gotten through 10 years of hard work pinlighting with the best of them. He had to keep his sanity by not thinking very much about his job, meeting the strains of the task whenever he had to meet them, and thinking nothing more about his duties until the next emergency arose. Woodley never made a point of getting popular among the partners. None of the partners liked him very much. Some of them even resented him. He was suspected of thinking ugly thoughts of the partners on occasion, but since none of the partners ever thought a complaint in articulate form, the other pinlighters and the chiefs of the instrumentality left him alone. Underhill was still full of wonder of their job. Happily he babbled on. "What does happen to us when we planoform? Do you think it's sort of like dying? Did you ever see anybody who had his soul pulled out?" "Pulling souls is just a way of talking about it," said Woodley. "After all these years, nobody knows whether we have souls or not." "But I saw one once. I saw what Dogwood looked like when he came apart. There was something funny. It looked wet and sort of sticky, as if it were bleeding, and it went out of him. And you know what they did to Dogwood. They took him away, up in that part of the hospital where you and I never go. Way up at the top part where the others are, where the others always have to go if they are alive after the rats of the up and out have gotten them." Woodley sat down and lit an ancient pipe. He was burning something called tobacco in it. It was a dirty sort of habit, but it made him look very dashing and adventurous. "Look here, youngster. You don't have to worry about that stuff. Pinlighting is getting better all the time. The partners are getting better. I've seen them pinlight 2 rats 46 million miles apart in 1.5 milliseconds. As long as people had to try to work the pin sets themselves, there was always the chance that with a minimum of 400 milliseconds for the human mind to set a pinlight, we wouldn't light the rats up fast enough to protect our planoforming ships. The partners have changed all that. Once they get going, they're faster than rats, and they always will be. I know it's not easy, letting a partner share your mind." "It's not easy for them either," said Underhill. "Don't worry about them. They're not human. Let them take care of themselves. I've seen more pinlighters go crazy from monkeying around with partners than I have ever seen caught by the rats. How many do you actually know of them that got grabbed by rats?" Underhill looked down at his fingers, which shone green and purple in the vivid light thrown by the tuned-in pin set, and counted ships. The thumb for the Andromeda, lost with crew and passengers. The index finger and the middle finger for release ships 43 and 56. Found with their pin sets burned out and every man, woman, and child on board dead or insane. The ring finger, the little finger, and the thumb of the other hand were the first 3 battleships to be lost to the rats. Lost as people realized that there was something out there, underneath space itself, which was alive, capricious, and malevolent. Planoforming was sort of funny. It felt like nothing much, like the twinge of a mild electric shock, like the ache of a sore tooth bitten on for the first time, like a slightly painful flash of light against the eyes. Yet in that time, a 40,000-ton ship lifting free above Earth disappeared somehow or other into 2 dimensions and appeared half a light year or 50 light years off. At one moment he would be sitting in the fighting room, the pin set ready and the familiar solar system ticking around inside his head. For a second, or a year, he could never tell how long it really was subjectively, the funny little flash went through him, and then he was loose in the up and out, the terrible open spaces between the stars, where the stars themselves felt like pimples on his telepathic mind, and the planets were too far away to be sensed or read. Somewhere in this outer space a gruesome death awaited, death and horror of a kind which man had never encountered until he reached out for interstellar space itself. Apparently the light of the suns kept the dragons away. Dragons. That was what people called them. To ordinary people there was nothing except the shiver of planoforming and the hammer blow of sudden death, or the dark spastic note of lunacy descending into their minds. But to the telepaths, they were dragons. In the fraction of a second between the telepath's awareness of a hostile something out in the black, hollow nothingness of space and the impact of a ferocious, ruinous psychic blow against all living things within a ship, the telepaths had sensed entities, something like the dragons of ancient human lore, beasts more clever than beasts, demons more tangible than demons, hungry vortices of aliveness and hate compounded by unknown means out in the thin, tenuous matter between the stars. It took a surviving ship to bring back the news. A ship in which, by sheer chance, a telepath had a light beam ready, turning it out at the innocent dust so that within the panorama of his mind the dragon dissolved into nothing at all, and the other passengers, themselves non-telepathic, went about their way, not realizing that their own immediate deaths had been averted. From then on, it was easy. Almost. Planoforming ships always carried telepaths. Telepaths had their sensitiveness enlarged to an immense range by the pin sets, which were telepathic amplifiers adapted to the mammal mind. The pin sets, in turn, were electronically geared into small dirigible light bombs. Light did it. Light broke up the dragons, allowed the ships to reform three-dimensionally, skip, 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 as they moved from star to star. The odds suddenly moved down from 100 to 1 against mankind to 60 to 40 in mankind's favor. This was not enough. The telepaths were trained to become ultra-sensitive, trained to become aware of the dragons in less than a millisecond. But it was found that the dragons could move 1,000,000 miles in just under 2 milliseconds, and that this was not enough for the human mind to activate the light beams. Attempts had been made to sheath the ships in light at all times. This defense wore out. As mankind learned about the dragons, so too apparently the dragons learned about mankind. Somehow they flattened their own bulk and came in on extremely flat trajectories very quickly. Intense light was needed, light of sunlight intensity. This could be provided only by light bombs. Pinlighting came into existence. Pinlighting consisted of the detonation of ultra-vivid miniature photonuclear bombs, which converted a few ounces of magnesium isotope into pure visible radiance. The odds kept coming down in mankind's favor, yet ships were being lost. It became so bad that people didn't even want to find the ships, because the rescuers knew what they would see. It was sad to bring back to Earth 300 bodies ready for burial and 200 or 300 lunatics, damaged beyond repair, to be wakened and fed and cleaned and put to sleep, wakened and fed again until their lives were ended. Telepaths tried to reach into the minds of the psychotics who had been damaged by the dragons, but they found nothing there beyond vivid spouting columns of fiery terror bursting from the primordial id itself, the volcanic source of life. Then came the partners. Man and partner could do together what man could not do alone. Men had the intellect, partners had the speed. The partners rode their tiny craft, no larger than footballs, outside the spaceships. They planoformed with the ships. They rode beside them in their 6-pound craft, ready to attack. The tiny ships of the partners were swift. Each carried a dozen pinlights, bombs no bigger than thimbles. The pinlighters threw the partners, quite literally threw, by means of mind-to-firing relays direct at the dragons. What seemed to be dragons to the human mind appeared in the form of gigantic rats in the minds of the partners. Out in the pitiless nothingness of space, the partners' minds responded to an instinct as old as life. The partners attacked, striking with a speed faster than man's, going from attack to attack until the rats or themselves were destroyed. Almost all the time, it was the partners who won. With the safety of the interstellar skip of the ships, commerce increased immensely. The population of all the colonies went up, and the demand for trained partners was increased. Underhill and Woodley were part of the third generation of pinlighters, and yet to them it seemed as though their craft had endured forever. Gearing space into minds by means of the pin set, adding the partners to those minds, keying up the minds for the tension of a fight on which all depended. This was more than human synapses could stand for long. Underhill needed his 2 months' rest after half an hour of fighting. Woodley needed his retirement after 10 years of service. They were young, they were good, but they had limitations. So much depended on the choice of partners, so much on the sheer luck of who drew whom. The shuffle. Father Moontree and the little girl named West entered the room. They were the other 2 pinlighters. The human complement of the fighting room was now complete. Father Moontree was a red-faced man of 45 who had lived the peaceful life of a farmer until he reached his 40th year. Only then, belatedly, did the authorities find he was telepathic and agree to let him late in life enter upon the career of a pinlighter. He did well at it, but he was fantastically old for this kind of business. Father Moontree looked at the glum Woodley and the musing Underhill. "How are the youngsters today? Ready for a good fight?" "Father always wants a fight," giggled the little girl named West. She was such a little girl. Her giggle was high and childish. She looked like the last person in the world one would expect to find in the rough, sharp dueling of pin fighting. Underhill had been amused one time when he found one of the most sluggish of the partners coming away happy from contact with the mind of the girl named West. Usually the partners didn't care much about the human minds with which they were paired for the journey. The partners seemed to take the attitude that human minds were complex and fouled up beyond belief anyhow. No partner ever questioned the superiority of the human mind, though very few of the partners were much impressed by that superiority. The partners liked people. They were willing to fight with them. They were even willing to die for them. But when a partner liked an individual the way, for example, that Captain Wow or Lady May liked Underhill, the liking had nothing to do with intellect. It was a matter of temperament, of feel. Underhill knew perfectly well that Captain Wow regarded his, Underhill's, brains as silly. What Captain Wow liked was Underhill's friendly emotional structure, the cheerfulness and glint of wicked amusement that shot through Underhill's unconscious thought patterns, and the gaiety with which Underhill faced danger. The words, the history books, the ideas, the science. Underhill could sense all that in his own mind reflected back from Captain Wow's mind as so much rubbish. Miss West looked at Underhill. "I bet you've put stickum on the stones." "I did not." Underhill felt his ears grow red with embarrassment. During his novitiate he had tried to cheat in the lottery because he got particularly fond of a special partner, a lovely young mother named Myrrh. It was so much easier to operate with Myrrh, and she was so affectionate toward him that he forgot pinlighting was hard work and that he was not instructed to have a good time with his partner. They were both designed and prepared to go into deadly battle together. One cheating had been enough. They had found him out, and he had been laughed at for years. Father Moontree picked up the imitation leather cup and shook the stone dice which assigned them partners for the trip. By senior rights, he took first draw. He grimaced. He had drawn a greedy old character, a tough old male whose mind was full of slobbering thoughts of food, veritable oceans full of half-spoiled fish. Father Moontree had once said that he burped cod liver oil for weeks after drawing that particular glutton, so strongly had the telepathic image of fish impressed itself upon his mind. Yet the glutton was a glutton for danger as well as for fish. He had killed 63 dragons, more than any other partner in the service, and was quite literally worth his weight in gold. The little girl West came next. She drew Captain Wow. When she saw who it was, she smiled. "I like him," she said. "He's such fun to fight with. He feels so nice and cuddly in my mind." Cuddly hell, said Woodley. I've been in his mind, too. It's the most leering mind in the ship, bar none. Nasty man, said the little girl. She said it declaratively, without reproach. Underhill, looking at her, shivered. He didn't see how she could take Captain Wow so calmly. Captain Wow's mind did leer. When Captain Wow got excited in the middle of a battle, confused images of dragons, deadly rats, luscious beds, the smell of fish, and the shock of space all scrambled together in his mind as he and Captain Wow, their consciousnesses linked together through the pin set, became a fantastic composite of human being and Persian cat. That's the trouble with working with cats, thought Underhill. It's a pity that nothing else anywhere will serve as partner. Cats were all right once you got in touch with them telepathically. They were smart enough to meet the needs of the fight, but their motives and desires were certainly different from those of humans. They were companionable enough as long as you thought tangible images at them, but their minds just closed up and went to sleep when you recited Shakespeare or Colgrove, or if you tried to tell them what space was. It was sort of funny realizing that the partners who were so grim and mature out here in space were the same cute little animals that people had used as pets for thousands of years back on Earth. He had embarrassed himself more than once while on the ground saluting perfectly ordinary non-telepathic cats because he had forgotten for the moment that they were not partners. He picked up the cup and shook out his stone dice. He was lucky. He drew Lady May. The Lady May was the most thoughtful partner he had ever met. In her, the finely bred pedigree mind of a Persian cat had reached one of its highest peaks of development. She was more complex than any human woman, but the complexity was all one of emotions, memory, hope, and discriminated experience. Experience sorted through without the benefit of words. When he had first come into contact with her mind, he was astonished at its clarity. With her, he remembered her kittenhood. He remembered every mating experience she had ever had. He saw in a half-recognizable gallery all the other pinfighters with whom she had been paired for the fight, and he saw himself radiant, cheerful, and desirable. He even thought he caught the edge of a longing, a very flattering and yearning thought. What a pity he's not a cat. Woodley picked up the last stone. He drew what he deserved, a sullen, scarred old tomcat with none of the verve of Captain Wow. Woodley's partner was the most animal of all the cats on the ship, a low, brutish type with a dull mind. Even telepathy had not refined his character. His ears were half chewed off from the first fights in which he had engaged. He was a serviceable fighter, nothing more. Woodley grunted. Underhill glanced at him oddly. Didn't Woodley ever do anything but grunt? Father Moontree looked at the other three. You might as well get your partners now. I'll let the scanner know we're ready to go into the up and out. The deal. Underhill spun the combination lock on the Lady May's cage. He woke her gently and took her into his arms. She humped her back luxuriously, stretched her claws, started to purr, thought better of it, and licked him on the wrist instead. He did not have the pin set on, so their minds were closed to each other, but in the angle of her mustache and in the movement of her ears, he caught some sense of gratification she experienced in finding him as her partner. He talked to her in human speech, even though speech meant nothing to a cat when the pin set was not on. It's a damn shame, sending a sweet little thing like you whirling around in the coldness of nothing to hunt for rats that are bigger and deadlier than all of us put together. You didn't ask for this kind of fight, did you? For answer, she licked his hand, purred, tickled his cheek with her long fluffy tail, turned around and faced him, golden eyes shining. For a moment they stared at each other, man squatting, cat standing erect on her hind legs, front claws digging into his knee. Human eyes and cat eyes looked across an immensity which no words could meet, but which affection spanned in a single glance. Time to get in, he said. She walked docilely into her spheroid carrier. She climbed in. He saw to it that her miniature pin set rested firmly and comfortably against the base of her brain. He made sure that her claws were padded so that she could not tear herself in the excitement of battle. Softly he said to her, "Ready?" For answer, she preened her back as much as her harness would permit and purred softly within the confines of the frame that held her. He slapped down the lid and watched the sealant ooze around the seam. For a few hours she was welded into her projectile until a workman with a short cutting arc would remove her after she had done her duty. He picked up the entire projectile and slipped it into the ejection tube. He closed the door of the tube, spun the lock, seated himself in his chair, and put on his own pin set. Once again, he flung the switch. He sat in a small room. Small, small, warm, warm. The bodies of the other 3 people moving close around him, the tangible lights in the ceiling bright and heavy against his closed eyelids. As the pin set warmed, the room fell away. The other people ceased to be people and became small glowing heaps of fire, embers, dark red fire, with the consciousness of life burning like old red coals in a country fireplace. As the pin set warmed a little more, he felt Earth just below him, felt the ship slipping away, felt the turning moon as it swung on the far side of the world, felt the planets and the hot, clear goodness of the sun which kept the dragons so far from mankind's native ground. Finally, he reached complete awareness. He was telepathically alive to a range of millions of miles. He felt the dust which he had noticed earlier high above the ecliptic. With a thrill of warmth and tenderness, he felt the consciousness of the Lady May pouring over into his own. Her consciousness was as gentle and clear and yet sharp to the taste of his mind as if it were scented with oil. It felt relaxing and reassuring. He could sense her welcome of him. It was scarcely a thought, just a raw emotion of greeting. At last, they were one again. In a tiny remote corner of his mind, as tiny as the smallest toy he had ever seen in his childhood, he was still aware of the room and the ship, and of Father Moontree picking up a telephone and speaking to the scanner captain in charge of the ship. His telepathic mind caught the idea long before his ears could frame the words. The actual sound followed the idea the way that thunder on an ocean beach follows the lightning inward from far out over the seas. "The fighting room is ready. Clear to planoform, sir." The play. Underhill was always a little exasperated the way that Lady May experienced things before he did. He was braced for the quick vinegar thrill of planoforming, but he caught her report of it before his own nerves could register what happened. Earth had fallen so far away that he groped for several milliseconds before he found the sun in the upper rear right-hand corner of his telepathic mind. That was a good jump, he thought. This way we'll get there in 4 or 5 skips. A few hundred miles outside the ship, the Lady May thought back at him. "Oh warm, oh generous, oh gigantic man, oh brave, oh friendly, oh tender and huge partner. Oh wonderful with you so good, 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 warm, warm. Now to fight, now to go, good with you." He knew that she was not thinking words, that his mind took the clear, amiable babble of her cat intellect and translated it into images which his own thinking could record and understand. Neither one of them was absorbed in the game of mutual greetings. He reached out far beyond her range of perception to see if there was anything near the ship. It was funny how it was possible to do 2 things at once. He could scan space with his pin-set mind and yet at the same time catch a vagrant thought of hers. A lovely, affectionate thought about a son who had a golden face and a chest covered with soft, incredibly downy white fur. While he was still searching, he caught the warning from her. "We jump again." And so they had. The ship had moved to a second planoform. The stars were different. The sun was immeasurably far behind. Even the nearest stars were barely in contact. This was good dragon country. This open, nasty, hollow kind of space. He reached farther, faster, sensing and looking for danger, ready to fling the Lady May at danger wherever he found it. Terror blazed up in his mind, so sharp, so clear that it came through as a physical wrench. The little girl named West had found something immense, long, black, sharp, greedy, horrific. She flung Captain Wow at it. Underhill tried to keep his own mind clear. "Watch out," he shouted telepathically at the others, trying to move the Lady May around. At one corner of the battle he felt the lustful rage of Captain Wow as the big Persian tomcat detonated lights while he approached the streak of dust which threatened the ship and the people within. The lights scored near misses. The dust flattened itself, changing from the shape of a stingray into the shape of a spear. Not 3 milliseconds had elapsed. Father Moontree was talking human words and was saying in a voice that moved like cold molasses out of a heavy jar, "Captain." Underhill knew that the sentence was going to be, "Captain, move fast." The battle would be fought and finished before Father Moontree got through talking. Now, fractions of a millisecond later, the Lady May was directly in line. Here was where the skill and speed of the partners came in. She could react faster than he. She could see the threat as an immense rat coming direct at her. She could fire the light bombs with a discrimination which he might miss. He was connected with her mind, but he could not follow it. His consciousness absorbed the tearing wound inflicted by the alien enemy. It was like no wound on Earth, raw, crazy pain which started like a burn at his navel. He began to writhe in his chair. Actually, he had not yet had time to move a muscle when the Lady May struck back at their enemy. 5 evenly spaced photonuclear bombs blazed out across 100,000 miles. The pain in his mind and body vanished. He felt a moment of fierce, terrible, feral elation running through the mind of the Lady May as she finished her kill. It was always disappointing to the cats to find out that their enemies, whom they sensed as gigantic space rats, disappeared at the moment of destruction. Then he felt her hurt, the pain and the fear that swept over both of them as the battle, quicker than the movement of an eyelid, had come and gone. In the same instant there came the sharp and acid twinge of planoform. Once more the ship went skip. He could hear Woodley thinking at him. "You don't have to bother much. This old son of a gun and I will take over for a while." Twice again the twinge, the skip. He had no idea where he was until the lights of the Caledonia spaceport shone below. With a weariness that lay almost beyond the limits of thought, he threw his mind back into rapport with the pin set, fixing the Lady May's projectile gently and neatly into its launching tube. She was half dead with fatigue, but he could feel the beat of her heart, could listen to her panting, and he grasped the grateful edge of a thanks reaching from her mind to his. The score. They put him in the hospital at Caledonia. The doctor was friendly but firm. "You actually got touched by that dragon. That's as close a shave as I've ever seen. It's all so quick that it'll be a long time before we know what happened scientifically. But I suppose you'd be ready for the insane asylum now if the contact had lasted several tenths of a millisecond longer. What kind of cat did you have out in front of you?" Underhill felt the words coming out of him slowly. Words were such a lot of trouble compared with the speed and joy of thinking fast and sharp and clear, mind to mind. But words were all that could reach ordinary people like this doctor. His mouth moved heavily as he articulated words. "Don't call our partners cats. The right thing to call them is partners. They fight for us, in a team. You ought to know we call them partners, not cats. How is mine?" "I don't know," said the doctor contritely. "We'll find out for you. Meanwhile, old man, you take it easy. There's nothing but rest that can help you. Can you make yourself sleep, or would you like us to give you some kind of sedative?" "I can sleep," said Underhill. "I just want to know about the Lady May." The nurse joined in. She was a little antagonistic. "Don't you want to know about the other people?" "They're okay," said Underhill. "I knew that before I came in here." He stretched his arms and sighed and grinned at them. He could see they were relaxing and were beginning to treat him as a person instead of a patient. "I'm all right," he said. "Just let me know when I can go see my partner." A new thought struck him. He looked wildly at the doctor. "They didn't send her off with the ship, did they?" "I'll find out right away," said the doctor. He gave Underhill a reassuring squeeze of the shoulder and left the room. The nurse took a napkin off a goblet of chilled fruit juice. Underhill tried to smile at her. There seemed to be something wrong with the girl. He wished she would go away. First she had started to be friendly, and now she was distant again. It's a nuisance being telepathic, he thought. You keep trying to reach even when you're not making contact. Suddenly she swung around on him. "You pinlighters, you and your damned cats." Just as she stamped out, he burst into her mind. He saw himself a radiant hero, clad in his smooth suede uniform, the pin-set crown shining like ancient royal jewels around his head. He saw his own face, handsome and masculine, shining out of her mind. He saw himself very far away, and he saw himself as she hated him. She hated him in the secrecy of her own mind. She hated him because he was, she thought, proud and strange and rich, better and more beautiful than people like her. He cut off the sight of her mind, and as he buried his face in the pillow, he caught an image of the Lady May. She is a cat, he thought. That's all she is. A cat. But that was not how his mind saw her. Quick beyond all dreams of speed, sharp, clever, unbelievably graceful, beautiful, wordless, and undemanding. Where would he ever find a woman who could compare with her?
Russ Evans, Pilot 3497, Rocket Squad Patrol 34, unsnapped his seatbelt and with a slight push floated up into the air inside the weightless ship. He stretched himself and yawned broadly. "Red, how soon do we eat?" he called. "Shut up, you'll wake the others," replied a low voice from the rear of the swift little patrol ship. "Say anything?" "Several million stars," replied Evans in a lower voice. "And," his tone became suddenly severe, "Assistant Murphy, remember your manners when addressing your superior officer. I've a mind to report you." A flaming head of hair topping a grinning face poked around the edge of the door. "Lower your wavelength. Lower your wavelength. You may think you're a sun, but you're just a planetoid. But what I'd like to know, Chief Pilot Russ Evans, is why they locate a ship in a forlorn, out-of-the-way place like this, 750 million miles out of planetary plane. No ships ever come out here, no pirates, not a chance to help a wrecked ship. All we can do is sit here and watch the other fellows do the work. Which is exactly why we're here. Watch and tell the other ships where to go and when. Is that chow ready?" asked Russ, looking at a small clock giving New York time. Things should be on time. Come on and eat." Evans took one look at the telectroscope screen, then snapped it off. A tiny molecular towing unit in his hand, he pointed toward the door to the combined galley and lunchroom, and glided in the wake of Murphy. "How much fuel left?" he asked, as he glided into the dizzily spinning room. A cylindrical room, spinning at high speed, causing an artificial weight for the foods and materials in it, made eating of food a less difficult task. Expertly, he maneuvered himself to the guide rail near the center of the room and caught the spiral. Breaking himself into motion, he soon glided down its length and landed on his feet. He bent and flexed his muscles, waiting for the now busied assistant to get to the floor and reply. "To give us 2 pounds extra. Lord only knows why. Must expect us to clean up on some fleet. That makes 4-pound rolls left, untouched, and 2/3 of the original pound. We've been here 15 days and have 6 more to go. The main driving power rolls have about the same amount left, and 3-pound rolls in each reserve bin," replied Red, holding a curiously moving coffee pot that strove to adjust itself to rapidly changing air velocities as it neared the center of the room. "Sounds like a fleet's power stock. Martian lead or the terrestrial isotope?" asked Evans, tasting warily a peculiar dish before him. "Say, this is energy food. I thought we didn't get any more till Saturday." The change from the energy-less, flavored pastes that made up the principal bulk of a space pilot's diet to prevent overeating when no energy was used in walking in the weightless ship was indeed a welcome change. "Uh-huh, I got hungry. Any objections?" grinned the Irishman. "None," replied Evans fervently, pitching in with a will. Seated at the controls once more, he snapped the little switch that caused the screen to glow with flashing, swirling colors as the telectroscope apparatus came to life. 1,000 tiny points of flame appeared scattered on a black field with a suddenness that made them seem to snap suddenly into being. Points, tiny dimensionless points of light, save one, a tiny disk of blue-white flame, old Sol from a distance of close to 1 billion miles and under slight reverse magnification. The skillful hands at the controls were turning adjustments now, and that disk of flame seemed to leap toward him with 100 light speeds, growing to a disk as large as a dime in an instant, while the myriad points of the star seemed to scatter like frightened chickens, fleeing from the growing sun out of the screen. Other points, heretofore invisible, appeared, grew, and rushed away. The sun shifted from the center of the screen, and a smaller, reddish-green disk came into view. A planet, its atmosphere coloring the light that left it toward the red. It rushed nearer, grew larger. Earth spread as it took the center of the screen. A world, a portion of a world, a continent, a fragment of a continent, as the magnification increased, boundlessly it seemed, Finally, New York spread across the screen. New York seen from the air, with a strange lack of perspective. The buildings did not seem all to slant toward some point, but to stand vertical, for, from a distance of 1 billion miles, the vision lines were practically parallel. Titanic shafts of glowing color in the early summer sun appeared. The hot rays from the sun, now only 82,500,000 miles away, shimmering on the colored metal walls. The new airlines building, 1.5 miles high, supported at various points by actual spaceship driving units, was a riot of shifting rainbow hues. A new trick in construction had been used here, and Evans smiled at it. Arcot, inventor of the ship that carried him, had suggested it to Fuller, designer of that ship and of that building. The colored beryllium metal of the wall had been ruled with 20,000 lines to the inch, mere scratches, but nevertheless a diffraction grating. The result was amazingly beautiful. The sunlight, split up into its rainbow colors, was reflected in millions of shifting tints. In the air, supported by tiny packs strapped to their backs, thousands of people were moving, floating where they wished, in any direction, at any elevation. There were none of the helicopters of even 5 years ago now. A molecular power suit was far more convenient, cost nothing to operate, and but $50 to buy. Perfectly safe, requiring no skill, everyone owned them. To the watcher in space, they were mere moving, snaky lines of barely distinguishable dots that shivered and seemed to writhe in the refractions of the air. Passing over them, seeming to pass almost through them in this strange, perspectiveless view, were the shadowy forms of giant space liners, Titanic streamlined hulls. They were streamlined for no good reason, save that they looked faster and more graceful than the more efficient spherical freighters, just as passenger liners of 2 centuries earlier, with their steam engines, had carried 4 funnels and used 2. A space liner spent so minute a portion of its journey in the atmosphere that it was really inefficient to streamline them. "Won't be long," muttered Russ, grinning cheerily at the familiar sunlit city. His eyes darted to the chronometer beside him. The view seemed to be taken from a ship that was suddenly scudding across the heavens like a frightened thing, as it ran across from Manhattan Island, followed the Hudson for a short way, then cut across into New Jersey, swinging over the great woodland area of Kittatinny Park, resting finally on the New Jersey suburb of New York nestled in the Kittatinny's Blairtown. Low apartment buildings, 10 or 12 stories high, nestled in the waving green of trees in the old roadways. When ground traffic ceased, the streets had been torn up and parkways substituted. Quickly, the view singled out a single apartment, and the great smooth roof was enlarged on the screen to the absolute maximum clarity, till further magnification simply resulted in worse stratospheric distortion. On the broad roof were white strips of some material, making a huge V followed by 2 eyes. Russ watched, his hand on the control steadying the view under the Earth's complicated orbital motion and rotation, further corrections for the ship's orbital motion making the job one requiring great skill. The view held the center with amazing clarity. Something seemed to be happening to the last of the eyes. It crumpled suddenly, rolled in on itself, and disappeared. "She's there, and on time," grinned Russ happily. He tried more magnification. Could he? He was tired, terribly, suddenly tired. He took his hands from the viewplate controls, relaxed, and dropped off to sleep. What made me so tired? Wonder. God! He straightened with a jerk, and his hands flew to the controls. The view on the machine suddenly retreated, flew back with a velocity inconceivable. Earth dropped away from the ship with an apparent velocity 1,000 times that of light. It was a tiny ball, a pinpoint, gone. The sun, a minute disk, gone. Then the apparatus was flashing views into focus from the other side of the ship. The assistant did not reply. Evan's hands were growing ineffably heavy. His whole body yearned for sleep. Slowly, clumsily, he pawed for a little stud. Somehow his hand found it, and the ship reeled suddenly, little jerks, as the code message was flung out in a beam of such tremendous power that the sheer radiation pressure made it noticeable. Earth would be notified. The system would be warned. But light, slow crawling thing, would take hours to cross the gulf of space, and radio travels no faster. Half-conscious, fighting for his faculties with all his will, the pilot turned to the screen. A ship. A strange, glistening thing streamlined to the nth degree, every spare corner rounded till the resistance was at the irreducible minimum. But in the great pilot port of the stranger, the patrol pilot saw faces, and gasped in surprise as he saw them. Terrible faces, blotched, contorted. Patches of white skin, patches of brown, patches of black, blotch and twisted across the faces. Long, lean faces, great, wide, flat foreheads above, skulls strangely squared, more box-like than man's rounded skull. The ears were large, pointed tips at the top. Their hair was a silky mane that extended low over the forehead and ran back, spreading above the ears and down the neck. Then, as that emotion of surprise and astonishment weakened his will momentarily, oblivion came, with what seemed a fleeting instant of memories. His life seemed to flash before his mind in serried rank, a file of events, his childhood, his life, his marriage, his wife, an image of smiling comfort. Then the years, images of great and near-great men, his knowledge of history, pictures of Great War of 2074, pictures of the attackers of the Black Star, then calm oblivion, quiet blankness.
7 dreamers. You must understand that they were not professional dreamers. Professional dreamers are highly paid, respected, much sought-after talents. Like the majority of us, these 7 dreamt without effort or discipline. Dreaming professionally, so that one's dreams can be recorded and played back for the entertainment of others, is a much more demanding proposition. It requires the ability to regulate semi-conscious creative impulses and to stratify imagination, an extraordinarily difficult combination to achieve. A professional dreamer is simultaneously the most organized of all artists and the most spontaneous. A subtle weaver of speculation, not straightforward and clumsy like you or me, or these certain 7 sleepers. Of them all, Ripley came closest to possessing that special potential. She had a little ingrained dream talent and more flexibility of imagination than her companions. But she lacked real inspiration and the powerful maturity of thought characteristic of the pro-dreamer. She was very good at organizing stores and cargo, at pigeonholing carton A in storage chamber B, or matching up manifests. It was in the warehouse of the mind that her filing system went awry. Hopes and fears, speculations and half-creations slipped haphazardly from compartment to compartment. Warrant Officer Ripley needed more self-control. The raw Rococo thoughts lay waiting to be tapped just below the surface of realization. A little more effort, a greater intensity of self-recognition, and she would have made a pretty good pro-dreamer. Or so she occasionally thought. Captain Dallas now. He appeared lazy while being the best organized of all. Nor was he lacking in imagination. His beard was proof of that. Nobody took a beard into the freezers. Nobody except Dallas. It was part of his personality, he'd explained to more than one curious shipmate. He'd no more part with the antique facial fuzz than he would do with any other part of his anatomy. Captain of 2 ships, Dallas was. The interstellar tug Nostromo and his body. Both would remain intact in dreaming as well as when awake. So he had the regulatory capability and a modicum of imagination. But a professional dreamer requires a deal more than a modicum of the last, and that's a deficiency that can't be compensated for by a disproportionate quantity of the first. Dallas was no more realistic pro-dreamer material than Ripley. Kane was less controlled in thought and action than was Dallas, and possessed far less imagination. He was a good executive officer. Never would he be a captain. That requires a certain drive, coupled with the ability to command others, neither of which Kane had been blessed with. His dreams were translucent, formless shadows compared to those of Dallas, just as Kane was a thinner, less vibrant echo of the captain. That did not make him less likable, but pro-dreaming requires a certain extra energy, and Kane had barely enough for day-to-day living. Parker's dreams were not offensive, but they were less pastoral than Kane's. There was little imagination in them at all. They were too specialized and dealt only rarely with human things. One could expect nothing else from a ship's engineer. Direct they were, and occasionally ugly. In wakefulness, this deeply buried offal rarely showed itself when the engineer became irritated or angry. Most of the ooze and contempt fermenting at the bottom of his soul cistern was kept well hidden. His shipmates never saw beyond the distilled Parker floating on top, never had a glimpse of what was bubbling and brewing deep inside. Lambert was more the inspiration of dreamers than Dreamer herself. In hypersleep, her restless musings were filled with intersystem plottings and load factors cancelled out by fuel considerations. Occasionally, imagination entered into such dream structures, but never in a fashion fit to stir the blood of others. Parker and Brett often imagined their own systems interplotting with hers. They considered the question of load factors and spatial juxtapositions in a manner that would have infuriated Lambert had she been aware of them. Such unauthorized musings they kept to themselves, securely locked in daydreams and night dreams, lest they make her mad. It would not do to upset Lambert. As the Nostromo's navigator, she was the one primarily responsible for seeing them safely home, and that was the most exciting and desirable co-joining any man could imagine. Brett was only listed as an engineering technician. That was a fancy way of saying he was just as smart and knowledgeable as Parker, but lacked seniority. The two men formed an odd pair, unequal and utterly different to outsiders, yet they coexisted and functioned together smoothly. In large part, their success as both friends and co-workers was due to Brett never intruding on Parker's mental ground. The tech was as solemn and phlegmatic in outlook and speech as Parker was voluble and volatile. Parker could rant for hours over the failure of a microchip circuit, damning its ancestry back to the soil from which its rare earth constituents were first mined. Brett would patiently comment, "Right." For Brett, that single word was much more than a mere statement of opinion. It was an affirmation of self. For him, silence was the cleanest form of communication. In loquaciousness lay insanity. And then there was Ash. Ash was the science officer, but that wasn't what made his dreams so funny. Funny peculiar, not funny ha-ha. His dreams were the most professionally organized of all the crews. Of them all, his came nearest to matching his awakened self. Ash's dreams held absolutely no delusions. That wasn't surprising if you really knew Ash. None of his 6 crewmates did, though. Ash knew himself well. If asked, he could have told you why he could never become a pro-dreamer. None ever thought to ask, despite the fact that the science officer clearly found pro-dreaming more fascinating than any of them. Oh, and there was the cat, name of Jones, a very ordinary house cat, or in this instance, ship cat. Jones was a large yellow tom of uncertain parentage and independent mien, long accustomed to the vagaries of ship travel and the idiosyncrasies of humans who travelled through space. It too slept the cold sleep, and dreamt simple dreams of warm, dark places and gravity-bound mice. Of all the dreamers on board, he was the only contented one, though he could not be called an innocent. It was a shame none of them was qualified as pro-dreamers, since each had more time to dream in the course of their work than any dozen professionals, despite the slowing of their dream pace by the cold sleep. Necessity made dreaming their principal avocation. A deep space crew can't do anything in the freezers but sleep and dream. They might remain forever amateurs, but they had long ago become very competent ones. 7 of them there were. 7 quiet dreamers in search of a nightmare. While it possessed a consciousness of a sort, the Nostromo did not dream. It did not need to, any more than it needed the preserving effect of the freezers. If it did dream, such musings must have been brief and fleeting, since it never slept. It worked and maintained and made certain its hibernating human complement stayed always a step ahead of ever-ready death, which followed the cold sleep like a vast grey shark behind a ship at sea. Evidence of the Nostromo's unceasing mechanical vigilance was everywhere on the quiet ship, in soft hums and lights that formed the breath of instrumental sentience. It permeated the very fabric of the vessel, extended sensors to check every circuit and strut. It had sensors outside, too, monitoring the pulse of the cosmos. Those sensors had fastened on to an electromagnetic anomaly. One portion of the Nostromo's brain was particularly adept at distilling sense out of anomalies. It had thoroughly chewed this one up, found the flavor puzzling, examined the results of analysis, and reached a decision. Slumbering instrumentalities were activated. Dormant circuits again regulated the flow of electrons. In celebration of this decision, banks of brilliant lights winked on, life signs of stirring mechanical breath. A distinctive beeping sounded, though as yet there were only artificial tympanums present to hear and acknowledge. It was a sound not heard on the Nostromo for some time, and it signified an infrequent happening. Within this awakening bottle of clicks and flashes, of devices conversing with each other, lay a special room. Within this room of white metal lay 7 cocoons of snow-colored metal and plastic. A new noise filled this chamber, an explosive exhalation that filled it with freshly scrubbed, breathable atmosphere. Mankind had willingly placed himself in this position, trusting in little tin gods like the Nostromo to provide him with the breath of life when he could not do so for himself. Extensions of that half-sentient electronic being now tested the newly exuded air and pronounced it satisfactory for sustaining life in puny organics such as men. Additional lights flared, more linkages closed. Without fanfare, the lids on the 7 chrysalises opened, and the caterpillar shapes within began to emerge once more into the light.
"This is the captain speaking," it said. "The Department of Astrophysics has just informed me that the star that we are approaching has a family of 10 planets, as well as many satellites and planetoids. It is possible that our voyage is over. In any case, we have been ordered by the Commodore to make the preliminary investigations. If our findings are hopeful, the main fleet will be diverted to this system. All departmental heads will report at once to Control. That is all." Rogerez, who was halfway out of his trunks, pulled them on again. He got back into the shirt that carried the silver-crossed quill pens on its epaulets. He slid his feet into his sandals. Suzette sat on the bunk and watched him. Her thin, fine-featured face was thoughtful and serious under the pale yellow hair. mirage, she said. Do you think that this is the real thing this time? It could be, he said. It could be. She smiled faintly. But you're the chronicler, and you keep the records. And you have access to the records of the chroniclers before you. You could tell me just how many sterile balls of rock or mud or water we've investigated since the beginning of the exile. I could, he said. I advise you, Sue, not to get any false hopes. But the captain said that it was possible that our voyage was over, she said. What will it be like to live on the surface of a planet with room to stretch? What will it be like to have all the food we want instead of rations? All the water we want? What will it be like to be a real gardener? A real farmer, not a biochemist dabbling with seeds and shoots in tanks full of chemicals? What will it be like to be able to have children when we want to, not when some damn committee decides it's our turn to be parents? I hope, he said, that you find out, that we find out, but I must get along to control. One departmental head in the family is one too many, she said, smiling. I wish that you could stay with me to hear the news as it's released. So do I, he said. He kissed her briefly, opened the door, and almost ran out into the alleyway. He was the last to reach control. All the others were already there. Captain Maris, Kane, the chief officer, Blish and Cat, the two chief engineers, Crandall, the communications officer, Deal, who commanded the ground forces, Hain, the surgeon, Hamel, the biochemist, Claver, the purser, Keene, the astrophysicist. Rogerez stood in the doorway looking at them, at the men and women who were the rulers of this little man-made world. He looked beyond them to the banked instruments and controls, to the big screens upon which the stars were, to the laymen, meaningless swirls and eddies of light against the blackness. He tried to get the feel of the occasion, began to toy with the phrases that he would use when writing his official account. Sit down, man, snapped Captain Maris. Don't interrupt his train of thought, sir, said Pamela cattily. Who knows what beautiful purple prose is running through his mind? Rogerez glared at her, but said nothing. After all, she was Susette's chief, and could make life hard for her. He took his seat at the foot of the long conference table. It's been worn shiny, he thought, by the elbows of generations. It's old, and the ship is old, and we are growing old with her. Will there never be an end to this voyaging? Keene, said the captain, tell us of your findings. With your permission, said the astrophysicist. The interstellar drive was shut down and observations made. The 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th planets seem to be utterly incapable of supporting life as we know it. It would be barely possible to establish a colony on the 4th planet. We have not yet been able to decide whether or not the 2nd planet is suitable. The 1st planet would be most unsuitable. Come to the point, man, said Colonel Deal impatiently. On my own time, Deal, replied Keene. After the preliminary observations, our attention was concentrated upon the 3rd planet. Its mass is almost identical with that of the home world. So is the relative distribution of land and water. The same may be said for atmospheric density and composition. Is it inhabited? Asked Deal. There is life, replied the scientist. Hamel will bear me out on that. Is there intelligent life? Asked the soldier. That does not concern us yet, Deal, said Captain Maris. My instructions from the Commodore are to make the preliminary survey from a safe orbit. No landing is to be attempted until the arrival of the main fleet. If there is intelligent life, we shall not strike until we are ready. Need there be war, Captain? Asked Hain. Might it not be possible to establish friendly relations with the natives? Was it possible, asked Maris, when the Glormingen landed on our homeworld? Between different races, there was only one possible state of affairs: war. Our world was taken from us by force. We shall take a new world by force." "I am ready," said Deal quietly. He looked around the table, a small, hard smile on his hard face. "He sees us all carrying guns, manning his artillery," thought Rogerez. After years of playing at soldiers, of studying strategy and tactics, he sees a chance of achieving what he thinks is his proper place in the scheme of things. "Cat," asked the captain, "how are your rockets?" "Ready, Captain," replied the reaction engineer. "They are always ready. My fuel tanks were refilled, as you know, only 20 years ago. The only consumption since then has been for the annual tests. Clever. In the unlikely event of our being ordered to send down a landing party before the arrival of the main fleet, how are your boat provisions?" "All boats are fully stocked," said the purser, "as always." "She looks," thought Rogerez, "like a plump, competent housewife of the old stories. And that, with any luck at all, is what she will be soon, with her own little home to worry about, and not a ship." "Rogerez," Maris went on, "I suppose that your records are up to date?" "They are, sir." "Then get them transmitted to the flagship for recording, and make it, from now on, a half-daily routine. Crandall, is all your equipment in good order?" "It is, Captain." "Keep it so. The Commodore must be kept informed of everything. Everything."